Maria Santos had always been tough. Growing up in a small fishing village in the Philippines, she learned early that the ocean didn't care about your gender when it came to hard work. At 28, she had calloused hands, sun-weathered skin, and the kind of determination that made her family proud. When the opportunity came to work on a commercial fishing vessel in Alaska, she didn't hesitate. The money was good, and she needed every dollar to support her younger siblings back home. The MV Northern Star was a massive ship, over 200 feet long, designed for deep-sea fishing in some of the world's most dangerous waters. Maria had worked on smaller boats before, but nothing like this. The crew quarters were cramped, the work was brutal, and the weather was unforgiving. But she was ready for all of that. What she wasn't ready for was Captain Reynolds. Captain James Reynolds was a man in his 50s with graying hair and a permanent scowl. He had been working these waters for over 30 years and had a reputation for being both skilled and ruthless. The other crew members spoke about him in hushed tones, warning newcomers to stay out of his way and never question his orders. Maria noticed how the men would look down when he passed, how conversations would stop abruptly when his boots echoed on the metal deck. On her first day, Maria was assigned to the processing line. The work involved sorting, cleaning, and packing fish as they came up from the nets. It was cold, wet, and exhausting, but she threw herself into it with the same energy she brought to everything else. The other workers, mostly men from various countries, watched her with curiosity. Few women worked on ships like this, and they weren't sure what to expect. "Keep up or get out," Reynolds barked as he walked past the processing area. He didn't look directly at Maria, but she felt the comment was meant for her. She worked faster, her hands moving efficiently through the endless stream of fish. By the end of her first 12-hour shift, her back ached and her fingers were numb from the cold. But she had kept pace with the most experienced workers. The crew lived in tight quarters below deck. Maria had a small bunk in a section with 3 other workers. There was barely enough room to sit up, and privacy was non-existent. The men she bunked with were respectful enough, but she could sense their discomfort. They had never shared such close quarters with a woman before, and the awkwardness was thick in the air. During her second week, Maria began to notice Captain Reynolds paying more attention to her than to the other crew members. He would appear suddenly while she was working, standing close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and feel his presence like a weight on her shoulders. He never said much, just watched her work with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "You're working too slow," he told her one afternoon, even though she was clearly keeping up with everyone else. "Maybe you should consider finding work on land where things are easier." Maria looked up from the fish she was processing, meeting his gaze directly. "I'm keeping up just fine, Captain." His eyes narrowed and she saw something dangerous flash across his face. But he walked away without another word, leaving Maria with a sick feeling in her stomach. She had dealt with difficult bosses before, but there was something different about Reynolds. Something that felt personal and threatening. The other crew members had witnessed the exchange, but they quickly looked away when Maria glanced in their direction. She understood their reluctance to get involved. Jobs like this were hard to come by, and nobody wanted to risk their position by crossing the captain. But their silence left her feeling isolated and vulnerable. As the days passed, the pattern continued. Reynolds would find fault with her work when there was none to find. He would assign her the worst tasks, the ones that other crew members had rotating duties for. When she completed these assignments without complaint, he would find new ways to make her life difficult. The other workers began to avoid her, not wanting to be associated with someone who had clearly fallen into the captain's bad graces. Maria's breaking point came during her 3rd week on the ship. She had been working a double shift because one of the other crew members had gotten sick. She was exhausted, her movements slower than usual when Reynolds appeared at her station. He stood there for several minutes just watching her work, his presence making her nervous and clumsy. "I've been watching you," he said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You don't belong here. Women like you cause problems on ships like this." Maria continued working, trying to ignore him, but her hands were shaking slightly. She had dealt with sexism before, but never in such an isolated environment, where she had nowhere to go and no one to turn to for help. "Are you listening to me?" Reynolds stepped closer, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "I hear you, Captain," Maria replied, not looking up from her work. "Good. Because I'm thinking it might be time for you to find other employment." Accidents happen on ships, especially to people who don't know their place. The threat was clear, and Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold Alaskan air. She was hundreds of miles from shore, surrounded by water and dependent on this man for her safety and her livelihood. But even as fear crept up her spine, another feeling was growing stronger. Anger. Pure, righteous anger at being threatened and bullied simply for being a woman who dared to work in a man's world. That night, lying in her cramped bunk listening to the snores of her bunkmates, Maria made a decision. She wasn't going to be driven away by a bully no matter how much power he had. She had come too far and worked too hard to let someone like Reynolds destroy her opportunity. Whatever happened next, she was going to stand her ground. The next morning brought rough seas and an even rougher Captain Reynolds. Maria woke before dawn to the sound of him shouting orders over the ship's intercom system. The weather had turned during the night, and waves were crashing over the deck with increasing intensity. This was exactly the kind of dangerous condition that made commercial fishing one of the world's most deadly professions. As Maria made her way to the processing area, she noticed the other crew members looked tense and worried. The ship was rolling heavily from side to side, making it difficult to maintain balance. Everything that wasn't tied down was sliding back and forth across the deck, creating a constant symphony of crashes and thuds. All hands on deck. Reynolds' voice boomed through the speakers. "We've got nets to bring in, and I don't care if Neptune himself is trying to stop us." Maria grabbed her rain gear and headed topside with the rest of the crew. The wind hit her like a physical blow, carrying stinging salt spray that made it hard to see. The deck was slick with seawater, and she had to grab onto whatever she could find to keep from being swept overboard. She had worked in rough weather before, but never anything quite this intense. The crew worked together to bring in the nets, a dangerous process made even more treacherous by the rolling sea. Maria found herself working alongside Tom Chen, a veteran fisherman from Seattle who had been on the Northern Star for over 5 years. Unlike the other crew members, Tom hadn't been avoiding her since her run-ins with the captain. "Stay low and keep your safety line attached," Tom shouted over the wind. "Reynolds pushes too hard in weather like this. Lost a man 2 years ago because he wouldn't wait for conditions to improve." Maria nodded, understanding the warning behind his words. She clipped her safety harness to the deck rail and focused on the task at hand. The nets were heavy with fish, but they were also heavy with seawater, making them incredibly difficult to handle. Every wave that crashed over the deck threatened to knock someone off their feet. Captain Reynolds stood on the bridge, seemingly oblivious to the danger his crew was facing. Through the bridge windows, Maria could see him barking orders at the helmsman, gesturing wildly as he directed the ship's movements. He was focused entirely on the catch, treating his crew like expendable equipment rather than human beings. "Faster," his voice came through the deck speakers. "I've seen old ladies move quicker than you bunch of amateurs." Maria gritted her teeth and worked harder, but the conditions were becoming increasingly dangerous. The deck was now awash with several inches of seawater that sloshed back and forth with each roll of the ship. One of the younger crew members, a kid named Danny from Oregon, slipped and nearly went over the side before 2 other men grabbed him. "Captain, we need to secure the deck," Tom shouted into his radio. "Conditions are getting too dangerous." "Keep working," came the immediate response. "We're not stopping until those nets are empty." It was then that Maria noticed something that made her blood run cold. The safety rail near the stern had been damaged during the night, leaving a gap of about 3 feet where there was nothing to prevent someone from going overboard. The broken rail was partially hidden by the chaos on deck, making it a deadly trap for anyone who wasn't paying attention. She grabbed Tom's arm and pointed toward the damaged section. His face went pale when he saw it. "We need to rope that off," he said, but before he could move, Captain Reynolds' voice cut through the wind again. "Santos, get over here and help with the winch." Maria looked toward the winch, then back at the broken rail. The winch was located just a few feet from the dangerous gap. Reynolds had to have seen the damage, which meant he was deliberately sending her into harm's way. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was attempted murder. Tom saw the same thing she did. "Don't go," he said quietly. That's not an accident, but Maria was already moving. If she refused a direct order, Reynolds would have grounds to fire her immediately and probably would claim she was insubordinate and unsafe. If she went to the winch, she would be working right next to a 3-foot gap in the safety rail while massive waves crashed over the deck. Either way, Reynolds won. As she made her way toward the stern, Maria's mind raced. She had dealt with bullies before, but never one with the power of life and death over her. Reynolds was counting on her being too afraid to stand up to him, too dependent on the job to fight back. But he had miscalculated. Maria hadn't survived growing up in poverty and fighting for every opportunity, just to be defeated by one angry man. She reached the winch and began working the controls, hyper-aware of the broken rail just feet away. Every wave that crashed over the deck sent water rushing toward the gap, and she had to brace herself constantly to avoid being swept toward it. The work required her full attention, but she couldn't afford to let her guard down for even a second. Having trouble there, Santos? Reynolds' voice came from behind her. Maria spun around to find the captain standing just a few feet away, having come down from the bridge. He was watching her with an expression that was part amusement and part malice. The wind was so loud that the other crew members couldn't hear their conversation. "No trouble, Captain," Maria replied, raising her voice to be heard over the storm. "Good. Because it would be a real shame if something happened to you out here. Accidents happen so quickly in weather like this." He gestured toward the broken rail with a slight smile. "One wrong step and the ocean swallows you up. Probably wouldn't even find the body." The threat was absolutely clear now. Reynolds was telling her exactly what he intended to happen. Maria felt her anger building, but she forced herself to stay calm. Losing her temper now would only give him an excuse to claim she was unstable and dangerous. "I'll be careful, Captain," she said through gritted teeth. "See that you are." Reynolds turned to walk away, then paused. "Oh, and Santos? When we get back to port, you might want to start looking for another job. I don't think you're cut out for this kind of work." As he walked away, Maria realized that Tom and several other crew members had been watching the exchange. They couldn't hear what was said, but they could see the tension and the obvious threat in Reynolds' body language. Yet none of them moved to help or intervene. They were all too afraid of losing their own jobs. Maria continued working at the winch, her movements precise and controlled despite the dangerous conditions. But inside she was planning. Reynolds thought he had her trapped, thought he could intimidate her into quitting or worse. He was about to learn just how wrong he was about Maria Santos. The storm finally passed after 18 grueling hours, leaving the Northern Star's crew exhausted and shaken. Maria had survived her ordeal at the winch, but just barely. Twice, she had nearly been swept toward the broken rail, saved only by her quick reflexes and the safety harness that Tom had insisted she double-check before starting work. The close calls hadn't been accidents, and everyone on deck knew it. Back in the crew quarters, the atmosphere was tense. The men spoke in whispers, shooting glances toward Maria's bunk when they thought she wasn't looking. They had witnessed something that crossed a line, but none of them seemed willing to acknowledge it openly. The unspoken rule on ships like the Northern Star was simple. The captain's word was law, and challenging that law could cost you everything. Maria lay in her narrow bunk, staring at the metal ceiling just inches from her face. Her body ached from the physical strain of the past day, but her mind was crystal clear. She had seen the look in Reynolds' eyes when he threatened her. This wasn't going to end with her quietly quitting and disappearing. He wanted to make an example of her, to show any future female crew members what happened to women who dared to work in his domain. Tom Chen approached her bunk during the next shift change. The older fisherman looked troubled, his weathered face creased with worry lines that seemed deeper than usual. He glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard before speaking in a low voice. "What happened out there wasn't right," he said quietly. "That rail didn't break by accident and sending you to work right next to it." He shook his head. "I've been on these boats for 20 years and I've never seen anything like it." Maria sat up, studying Tom's face. Of all the crew members, he was the only one who seemed willing to acknowledge what everyone had witnessed. "What are you saying, Tom?" "I'm saying Reynolds is trying to get you killed, and if you stay on this ship, he's going to succeed." Tom's voice was barely above a whisper. There are ways to make accidents look real out here. A slip on a wet deck, a malfunction with the machinery, a fall overboard during a night watch. The ocean doesn't leave witnesses. "So what do you suggest I do?" Maria asked. "Jump ship in the middle of Alaska?" Tom was quiet for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small digital camera. "My daughter gave me this before my last trip." "Takes video, too. Maybe it's time someone started documenting what really goes on aboard this ship." Maria stared at the camera, understanding immediately what Tom was suggesting. If Reynolds was going to continue his harassment and threats, Having evidence could be the difference between life and death. But it was also incredibly risky. If the captain found out they were recording him, the consequences would be severe. He searches the crew quarters sometimes, Tom continued. Looking for contraband, he says. But you could hide this in your work gear, small enough to fit in a tool pouch. Maria took the camera, feeling its weight in her palm. It was a lifeline, but also a dangerous weapon that could backfire if discovered. Why are you helping me? Because I have a daughter about your age, Tom replied. And because someone needs to stand up to bastards like Reynolds before they kill someone. Over the next few days, Maria began carrying the camera with her, learning to operate it discreetly. She recorded Reynolds' verbal abuse, his threats, and his increasingly erratic behavior. The footage wasn't perfect, but it clearly showed a pattern of harassment and intimidation that went far beyond normal workplace discipline. The captain seemed to sense that something had changed. Maria was no longer cowering when he approached, no longer looking down when he spoke to her. If anything, she seemed more confident, more defiant. This only served to increase his anger and make his behavior more extreme. You're getting too comfortable, Santos, he told her one afternoon while she was working on the processing line. Maybe it's time you learned some respect. That evening, Reynolds called a crew meeting in the ship's mess hall. All 12 crew members gathered around the metal tables, wondering what had prompted the unusual assembly. The captain stood at the front of the room, his arms crossed and his expression dark. It's come to my attention that some of you think you can question my authority, he began, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Maria. Let me remind you that on this ship my word is absolute law. Anyone who thinks otherwise is welcome to swim back to shore. The room was dead silent. Maria kept her expression neutral, but her hand moved slightly to the tool pouch where she had hidden the camera. If Reynolds was planning something dramatic, she wanted it documented. Some people seem to think that working on this ship is a right rather than a privilege, Reynolds continued. They think they can file complaints or cause trouble without consequences. Let me be very clear about something. There are no witnesses out here, and the ocean doesn't care about your problems. The threat was directed at Maria, but it was meant for the entire crew. Reynolds was making it clear that anyone who supported her or tried to intervene would face the same treatment. The message was received. Maria could see the fear in the other men's eyes. After the meeting, the crew dispersed quickly, eager to get away from the toxic atmosphere. Maria remained behind, pretending to clean up the mess hall while actually reviewing the footage she had captured. Reynolds' threats were clearly recorded, along with his implicit admission that he had been planning to harm crew members who opposed him. As she prepared to leave, Captain Reynolds appeared in the doorway. The rest of the crew had gone to their bunks, leaving them alone in the mess hall. Maria's hand moved instinctively to her tool pouch, but she forced herself to remain calm. Staying late, Santos? Reynolds stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. Working hard to prove yourself? Just finishing up, Captain, Maria replied, continuing to wipe down the tables. You know, I've been thinking about our conversation during the storm, Reynolds said, moving closer. About accidents and how quickly they can happen. I think it's time you and I had a more detailed discussion about your future on this ship. Maria straightened up, meeting his gaze directly. She could smell alcohol on his breath and realized that the captain had been drinking. This made him more dangerous and unpredictable, but it also meant he was more likely to say something incriminating. What kind of discussion, Captain? Reynolds smiled, but there was nothing pleasant about the expression. The kind where you learn your place or you don't learn anything at all. The threat hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Maria realized that this was the moment she had been preparing for. Reynolds wasn't going to stop with threats and intimidation. He was escalating to direct confrontation, and she needed to be ready for whatever came next. Her hand tightened around the dish rag she was holding, and she positioned herself with a clear path to the exit. If Reynolds made a move, she would be ready. The scared young woman who had started this voyage was gone, replaced by someone who had been pushed too far and was finally ready to push back. The confrontation Maria had been dreading came 3 days later during the morning watch. She was on deck cleaning equipment when Captain Reynolds emerged from the bridge, carrying a large metal bucket filled with what appeared to be kitchen scraps and dirty water. The mixture smelled putrid, a combination of fish guts, grease, and waste that made her stomach turn just from the odor drifting across the deck. Maria continued her work, trying to ignore Reynolds' presence, but she could feel him watching her with that familiar malicious intensity. The other crew members on deck seemed to sense trouble brewing and began finding reasons to move away from the area. Within minutes, Maria found herself essentially alone with the captain. Exactly the situation she had been trying to avoid. "Santos," Reynolds called out, his voice carrying that false friendliness that she had learned to fear more than his outright anger. "Come over here. I have a special job for you." Maria looked up from the equipment she was cleaning, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'm busy with my assigned duties, Captain." "Your assigned duties are whatever I say they are," Reynolds replied, his smile becoming more predatory. "Now get over here, unless you think you're too good for honest work." Maria set down her cleaning supplies and walked toward him, every instinct screaming at her to be careful. She could see Tom Chen working near the stern, close enough to witness whatever was about to happen but too far away to intervene quickly. Her hand brushed against the tool pouch containing the camera, making sure the device was still recording. "You see this bucket?" Reynolds held up the container, sloshing its disgusting contents. "This is what happens to garbage on my ship, and I've been thinking that maybe it's time you learned where garbage belongs." The threat was clear, but Maria forced herself to remain calm. "What do you want me to do with it, Captain?" "Nothing," Reynolds said, his grin becoming savage. "But I'm going to show you what I do with troublemakers who don't know their place." Before Maria could react, Reynolds lifted the bucket and hurled its entire contents directly at her. The putrid mixture hit her with shocking force, soaking her from head to toe in a nauseating combination of fish guts, grease, food scraps, and filthy water. The smell was overwhelming, making her gag as the liquid dripped from her hair and clothes. The humiliation was intended to break her spirit, to reduce her to tears and submission in front of the crew. Reynolds stood there grinning, waiting for her to collapse or run away crying. He had used this tactic before on other crew members who had crossed him, and it had always worked. But he had seriously misjudged Maria Santos. Instead of crying or begging, Maria wiped the slime from her eyes and looked directly at Reynolds. Her voice was steady and calm when she spoke. "Is that supposed to make me quit, Captain?" Reynolds's grin faltered slightly. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. "You're done on this ship, Santos. Pack your gear." "I don't think so," Maria replied, taking a step closer to him. "You see, Captain, I've been recording everything you've done. Every threat, every attempt to put me in danger, and now this assault. It's all documented." The captain's face went from triumphant to furious in an instant. "You're lying." Maria pulled the small camera from her tool pouch, holding it up so he could see it clearly. 3 weeks of footage, Captain. Enough to end your career and probably put you in prison." Reynolds's reaction was swift and violent. He lunged forward, trying to grab the camera from her hand. "Give me that, you lying bitch." But Maria was ready for him. She had been anticipating this moment for days, and her reflexes were sharp from years of physical work. As Reynolds reached for the camera, she stepped to the side and brought her knee up hard into his stomach. The captain doubled over, gasping for air. "You want to fight?" Maria asked, her voice now carrying a dangerous edge. "Then let's fight." Reynolds straightened up, his face red with rage and embarrassment. He swung wildly at Maria, but she ducked under his arm and landed a solid punch to his ribs. The captain was bigger and stronger, but he was also drunk, out of shape and unprepared for serious resistance. "I'm going to kill you," Reynolds snarled, charging at her again. This time Maria didn't dodge. Instead, she planted her feet and met his charge head-on. When he got close enough, she grabbed him by the shirt and used his own momentum to throw him to the deck. Reynolds hit the wet metal surface hard, his head making a sickening thud against the steel plating. The captain tried to get up, but Maria was already moving. She had learned to fight growing up in a rough neighborhood, and she had never forgotten those lessons. As Reynolds struggled to his hands and knees, she delivered a perfectly timed punch to the side of his head, right behind his ear. It was a precision strike designed to shut down his nervous system without causing permanent damage. Captain Reynolds collapsed to the deck like a sack of grain, unconscious before he hit the ground. Maria stood over him, breathing hard but in complete control. The putrid mixture from the bucket still covered her from head to toe, but she no longer felt humiliated. Instead, she felt powerful. The sound of footsteps made her look up. Tom Chen and several other crew members were running toward them, their faces showing a mixture of shock and awe. They had witnessed the entire confrontation, from the bucket attack to Reynolds's defeat. "Jesus Christ, Maria," Tom breathed, staring down at the unconscious captain. "You knocked him out cold." He had it coming, Maria replied simply. She knelt down and checked Reynolds' pulse to make sure she hadn't seriously injured him. The captain was breathing normally and his pulse was steady. He would have a massive headache when he woke up, but he would be fine. What happens now? Asked Danny, the young crew member from Oregon. His voice was filled with amazement and fear. Maria stood up and looked around at the assembled crew. These men had watched her be threatened, harassed, and humiliated for weeks without lifting a finger to help. But now she saw something different in their faces. Respect. Now we wait for him to wake up, Maria said, gesturing toward Reynolds. And then we have a conversation about how things are going to work on this ship from now on. Tom Chen laughed, a sound of pure admiration. I think that conversation is going to be very different from what he was expecting. Maria smiled for the first time in weeks. She was still covered in garbage, standing over an unconscious man who had tried to destroy her. But she had never felt more in control of her destiny. Captain Reynolds had wanted to teach her a lesson about knowing her place. Instead, he was about to learn that her place was wherever she chose to stand. Captain Reynolds remained unconscious for nearly 20 minutes, long enough for Maria to clean herself up and for the crew to process what they had witnessed. Word spread quickly through the ship, and soon every crew member had gathered on deck to see the captain lying motionless, while Maria stood guard over him, the camera still in her hand. When Reynolds finally stirred, he was greeted by the sight of his entire crew staring down at him with expressions ranging from amusement to outright satisfaction. The power dynamic on the Northern Star had shifted dramatically in those 20 minutes, and everyone could feel the change in the air. What the hell? Reynolds mumbled, struggling to sit up. His hand went to the side of his head where Maria had struck him, and he winced at the pain. For a moment he seemed confused about where he was and what had happened. Welcome back, Captain, Maria said calmly. She was now clean and dry, having changed into fresh clothes, but she still held the camera prominently in her hand. We need to talk. The memories came flooding back to Reynolds as his vision cleared. The bucket, the fight, the humiliation of being knocked unconscious by a woman half his size. His face flushed red with a combination of embarrassment and rage. You're finished, Santos, he snarled, struggling to his feet. Assaulting a ship's captain is a federal crime. I'll have you arrested the moment we reach port. Actually, Captain, Tom Chen stepped forward. We all saw what happened. You attacked Maria first. She was defending herself. Reynolds looked around at his crew, expecting to see the usual fearful submission. Instead, he found faces that were closed and unfriendly. The men who had cowered before him for years were now standing behind a woman they had barely known for a month. You were all witnesses to a mutiny, Reynolds said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. When we get back to port, every one of you will be blacklisted from working on any ship in Alaska. I don't think so, Maria replied, holding up the camera. You see, Captain, I have 3 weeks of footage showing your harassment, your threats, and your attempts to put me in danger. Today's assault is just the latest in a long pattern of abuse. She pressed a button on the camera and played back some of the recorded audio. Reynolds' voice filled the air, threatening to have Maria killed and claiming that there were no witnesses in the middle of the ocean. The captain's face went pale as he listened to his own words. That recording is illegal, Reynolds said, but his voice was shaky now. You can't record someone without their consent. Actually, Captain, Maria smiled. Alaska is a one-party consent state. As long as one person in the conversation knows about the recording, it's perfectly legal. And since I was always the one being threatened, I was well within my rights to document it. The legal implications hit Reynolds like a physical blow. He was looking at potential criminal charges for assault, harassment, and creating a hostile work environment. Worse, the evidence was clear and undeniable. His career was over and he knew it. What do you want? He asked finally, his voice defeated. First, I want an apology, Maria said. A real one in front of the entire crew. Reynolds looked around at the faces surrounding him. These men had watched him terrorize Maria for weeks, and now they were watching him be brought low by his victim. The humiliation was almost unbearable, but he had no choice. I apologize, he said through gritted teeth. For what specifically? Maria pressed. For the harassment. And the threats. And what happened today with the bucket. And, Maria prompted, Reynolds' jaw clenched. And for creating a hostile work environment. Good. Second, you're going to stay in your quarters for the rest of this voyage. Tom Chen will serve as acting captain until we reach port. You can't do that, Reynolds protested. I'm the captain of this vessel. Actually, you just assaulted a crew member and have been documented making threats against multiple people, Tom interjected. Maritime law allows for the temporary removal of a captain who poses a danger to his crew. Maria nodded. And third, when we reach port, you're going to quietly resign and disappear. You'll tell the company that you're retiring for health reasons. No fuss, no drama, no attempt to retaliate against anyone on this crew. And if I refuse? Reynolds asked. Then this footage goes to the Coast Guard, the FBI, and every maritime publication in the country. Your face will be on the front page of every fishing industry magazine as the captain who assaulted a female crew member. You'll never work on a ship again, and you'll probably spend the next few years in federal prison. The silence stretched out as Reynolds considered his options. He was trapped and everyone knew it. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and Maria had clearly thought through every aspect of the situation. I want to see that camera destroyed, he said finally. No deal, Maria replied immediately. This footage is my insurance policy. As long as you honor our agreement, it stays private. But if you ever try to come after me or anyone on this crew, it goes public immediately. Reynolds looked around at his crew one more time, seeing the finality in their faces. His reign of terror was over, ended by a young woman who had refused to be intimidated. Fine, he said, the word coming out like a physical pain. I agree to your terms. Good, Maria said. Tom, would you escort the captain to his quarters? I think he needs to rest after his accident. As Tom and two other crew members led Reynolds away, the remaining men gathered around Maria. The atmosphere was completely different from the fearful silence that had dominated the ship for weeks. I can't believe you actually did it, Danny said, shaking his head in amazement. Nobody's ever stood up to him like that. Someone should have done it years ago, replied Jake Morrison, an older fisherman from Texas. That man was a menace to everyone who worked under him. Maria pocketed the camera and looked out at the ocean. The waters were calm now, reflecting the late afternoon sun like a mirror. For the first time since boarding the Northern Star, she felt truly safe. It's not about me, she said finally. It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else. Captain Reynolds was counting on everyone being too afraid to fight back. But bullies only win when good people do nothing. Tom Chen returned from escorting Reynolds to his quarters, a satisfied expression on his weathered face. He's locked in and not happy about it, but he's not going anywhere. I've also confiscated the key to the ship's communication equipment, just to make sure he doesn't try to call in any favors. The crew spent the rest of the day working with an energy and enthusiasm that hadn't been seen in months. Without the captain's constant threats and abuse, the men were able to focus on their jobs and actually enjoy the work they were doing. Maria found herself at the center of a group that was no longer afraid to speak freely or laugh out loud. As the sun set over the Alaskan waters, Maria stood at the bow of the ship, watching the horizon. She had come aboard the Northern Star as just another crew member, hoping to make some money and support her family. She was leaving it as something else entirely, a woman who had proven that sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to knock him down. The Northern Star returned to port in Kodiak, Alaska, 5 days later under the command of acting Captain Tom Chen. The voyage that should have taken another 2 weeks had been cut short due to what the official log listed as a medical emergency involving the captain. Nobody questioned the story, especially since Reynolds remained in his quarters throughout the journey, claiming to be suffering from severe headaches and dizziness. As the ship docked, Maria stood on deck watching the familiar bustle of the harbor. Fishing vessels of all sizes were coming and going, their crews unloading catches and preparing for their next voyages. She had been dreading this moment for days, wondering if Reynolds would try to break their agreement once they reached shore, and he had access to lawyers and company officials. Tom Chen approached her as the crew prepared to disembark. You ready for this? He asked quietly. As ready as I'll ever be, Maria replied, patting the pocket where she kept the camera. What about you? Are you prepared to take over permanently if the company offers you the position? Tom smiled. After 20 years of being told what to do by men like Reynolds, I think I'm ready to show them how a ship should really be run. With respect for the crew and safety as the top priority. The crew gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the ship. Maria noticed that several of the men approached her to shake hands and express their gratitude. These were the same men who had avoided her just a week ago, too afraid of Reynolds to show any support. Now they were treating her like a hero. "What you did took real courage," Jake Morrison told her as he shouldered his duffel bag. "My daughter works in construction, and she faces the same kind of harassment from supervisors who think women don't belong on job sites. I'm going to tell her about you." Danny, the young crew member from Oregon, was more direct. "You probably saved my life out there." Reynolds was getting worse every trip, and eventually someone was going to get seriously hurt. "Thank you for standing up to him." As the crew disembarked, Maria saw a black sedan waiting at the end of the dock. 2 men in suits stood beside it, and she recognized one of them as Robert Harrison, the regional manager for Northern Pacific Fisheries. Her stomach tightened as she realized that Reynolds had apparently made some calls after all. "Ms. Santos," Harrison called out as she walked down the gangplank. "Could we have a word with you?" Maria exchanged glances with Tom, who nodded encouragingly. "I'll be right behind you," he said quietly. The conversation took place in a small office overlooking the harbor. Harrison sat behind a metal desk while his companion, who introduced himself as the company's legal counsel, took notes. Maria sat across from them, the camera in her pocket feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. "We've received some disturbing reports about the voyage," Harrison began. "Captain Reynolds claims that you assaulted him and threatened him with false accusations. Is that what he told you?" Maria asked calmly. "He also says you've been filming company operations without permission, which violates your employment contract," the lawyer added. Maria pulled out the camera and set it on the desk between them. "Gentlemen, before we go any further, I think you should see what actually happened on that ship." For the next hour, she played selected footage from the 3 weeks of recording. The executives watched in growing horror as Reynolds' pattern of harassment, threats, and abuse became undeniable. When the recording reached the bucket incident and its aftermath, both men were visibly shaken. "My God," Harrison said quietly. "How long has this been going on?" "According to the crew, Reynolds has been abusing his authority for years," Maria replied. "I was just the first person to document it and fight back." The lawyer leaned forward. "Ms. Santos, you need to understand that what you've shown us represents serious legal liability for the company. If this footage became public, it would destroy your reputation and probably result in massive lawsuits," Maria finished. "I'm aware of that." Harrison and the lawyer exchanged meaningful glances. "What is it that you want?" Harrison asked. "First, I want Captain Reynolds permanently removed from command of any vessel in your fleet. No transfers, no second chances, no quiet resignation that lets him move to another company. He's done." "Agreed," Harrison said immediately. "Second, I want Tom Chen promoted to captain of the Northern Star. He's earned it, and the crew respects him." Also agreed. "Third, I want the company to implement a zero-tolerance policy for harassment and abuse, with clear reporting procedures that don't require crew members to report to the person who's harassing them." The lawyer took notes frantically as Maria outlined her demands. These were reasonable requests that any responsible company should have already implemented. "And finally," Maria continued, "I want a written guarantee that no one from this crew will face retaliation for supporting me or witnessing against Reynolds." They were afraid to speak up before, but they found their courage when it mattered. "Done," Harrison said. "Is there anything else?" Maria thought for a moment. "Actually, yes. I want the company to create a scholarship program for women who want to work in the maritime industry. Too many talented people are being driven away because they don't have support when they face harassment." Harrison smiled for the first time since the meeting began. "I think we can arrange that. What would you like to call it?" "The Northern Star Fellowship," Maria replied. "For women who refuse to be intimidated." The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises of swift action. As Maria left the office, she found Tom and several other crew members waiting for her in the harbor parking lot. Their faces were anxious, wondering if she had been able to protect them from Reynolds' retaliation. "How did it go?" Tom asked. "Reynolds is finished," Maria announced. "And you're the new captain of the Northern Star, effective immediately." The cheer that went up from the crew could probably be heard across the harbor. These men had lived in fear for so long that they had almost forgotten what it felt like to be treated with respect and dignity. Over the following weeks, the changes at Northern Pacific Fisheries became the talk of the Alaska fishing industry. Captain Reynolds quietly disappeared, reportedly taking an early retirement for health reasons. Tom Chen's promotion was announced with fanfare, and the company's new harassment policy became a model for other maritime employers. Maria returned to the Philippines for a brief visit with her family, using her earnings from the voyage to help her siblings with their education. When she came back to Alaska 2 months later, she found job offers waiting from half a dozen fishing companies, all eager to hire the woman who had become something of a legend in the industry. She chose to return to the Northern Star under Captain Chen's command, but this time as the ship's first female first mate. The crew that welcomed her back was almost entirely different from the one she had left, composed of men and women who had heard about the changes aboard the ship and wanted to be part of something better. On her first night back at sea, Maria stood on the bridge beside Tom as he navigated through calm waters under a star-filled sky. The Northern Star felt like a completely different ship now, filled with purpose and mutual respect instead of fear and intimidation. "Any regrets?" Tom asked as they watched the horizon. Maria thought about the question seriously. The confrontation with Reynolds had changed her life in ways she was still discovering. She had become an advocate for workers' rights and had spoken at several industry conferences about the importance of fighting harassment. The shy young woman who had boarded the ship months ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own strength and wasn't afraid to use it. "No regrets," she said finally. "Reynolds needed to be stopped, and I'm glad I was the one who did it. But more importantly, we proved that bullies only win when good people stay silent." The Northern Star continued through the night, carrying a crew that had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the best way to deal with someone who pours a bucket over your head is to knock them out cold and take command of your own destiny.